Okay. So last week we quoted the verses when she says, Simani kachotam ali beich, place me as a signet or as a seal on your arm, a seal on your heart, like a seal on your arm. And that was last week. And then you have another verse, which is explained elsewhere in the writings of Rabbi Shneir Zalman, but I don't think we'll do that today. I'm going to share the screen. That's verse number 8, beautiful verse. Mayim Rabbi, many waters cannot quench the love. Really, it's extinguish. Many waters cannot extinguish the love, nor can rivers flood it. Should a man give all the property of his house for love, they would despise him. Meaning to say, you can't buy love. When you have it, you can't lose it. Water cannot wash it away. If you can't buy love, it's either there or not there. And that was verse 7. That Rabbi Shneir Zalman explains elsewhere. It actually explains it in the parsha of Noach with the biblical flood. The discourse on the parsha of Noach begins with this verse, Mayim Rabim, great waters. And over there, he explains that great waters represent the difficulties of life on this earth, of earning a living and other worries, and the worries will not wash away the great love of the soul to God. But in any case, so this is verse 7. Now, verse 8 is interesting. You get the young woman's brothers talking. We haven't heard from her brothers all the way back. All the way up since chapter 1. In chapter 1, there was this discussion which mentions that she is, let's take a look. So I don't have to guess. Let's take a look. B'nei imi necharubi, right? So verse 6, do not look upon me disdainfully because I am swarthy, for the sun has gazed upon me. My mother's sons were incensed against me. They made me a keeper of the vineyards. My own vineyard I did not keep. That was verse 6. And the point was that over there you see it's a continuation to verse 6. I am black but comely, or despite the fact that I'm black, I'm beautiful. O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. And if you remember the discussion then, is that this is referring to saying on the outside, maybe I'm not as beautiful as you think at first glance because I am tanned by the sun, which in that culture meant you're working outside, you're of the working class. But she says, no, this is just temporary. It's basically what happened is my mother's sons, my brothers, made me a keeper of the vineyards. In other words, she was forced into this position, but it's not really her true identity. So that was the last time we heard about the brothers' sons. So we have a young woman, and the brothers want her to work in the field. And that's what she does. And when she's in the field, she's looking for her beloved. And that's verse 7. She says, tell me, you whom my soul loves, where do you fear? Where do you rest the flocks at noon? For why should I be like the one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? In other words, why am I going around looking for you? She's in the field with her sheep. There are other shepherds. She says, tell me where you are so I can come find you. But in any case, we had the mention of the brothers. The brothers were the people who put her to work to begin with. Now, so the brothers obviously they're incensed against her. That's the words she uses. B'nei imi nicharubi. My mother's sons were incensed against me. So they're not necessarily they're not really necessarily portrayed in a loving way. They don't love her. They don't necessarily care for her. Finally, but what happens in chapter 8? We're talking about the final marriage. In other words, after all the tribulations in chapter 8. They start thinking about, oh, we have a little sister, we have to marry her off, but we're not sure if she's ready yet, mature for marriage. That's what's happening here. So what does she read? So the brothers are talking. Verse 8, we have a little sister who has no breasts. What shall we do for our sister on the day she is spoken for? In other words, maybe she's not mature enough to get married, even physically mature. And then we don't know anything about her. If she be a wall, we will build upon her a silver turret. And if she be a door, we will enclose her with cedar boards. So the commentaries explain that this is a question of, they want to know what is her status. Is she modest? If she's modest, then she's like a wall. If she's a door open, then we have to protect her in that way. So these are the brothers, obviously not very close to her, not very loving. They don't even know if she's physically mature or not. But now she speaks and she says, I am a wall, in other words, modest. and my breasts are like towers. Then I was in his eyes as one who finds peace. In other words, she's saying to them, you're late to the game. I'm already mature enough for marriage, and I already found peace. In other words, I already found the relationship. So that is the conventional interpretation of the story. And then you have the story with Solomon had a vineyard, 2 verses here, which is sort of a separate question. And going back to the question of there was a vineyard that Solomon has and other people were using, and now the vineyard goes back to Solomon, and the people who used it were going to repay. So this can be understood sort of as a metaphor that who's the vineyard of Solomon? Solomon would be the man, the vineyard would be the woman perhaps, and other people were abusing her, and now they go back. That's another question. So let's look a little bit at verse 9 and 10, 8 and 9 and 10 really, which is the discussion of is she, where they say we have a young girl, maybe she's not mature, and she says, no, I am. So we'll see and in other words, she's saying, it's too late, I'm mature, and I'm not ready for marriage, I already found the peace. And that just conclude, and when you get to 13 and 14, 13, you, in other words, this is the man speaking to her, Hayoshevet, it's feminine, you, feminine, who sit in the gardens, the friends hearken to your voice. Let me hear it. This is the man talking to her. He's saying, you're sitting in the garden. Everybody's listening to you. Everybody wants to hear your voice. I also want to hear your voice. What does she respond? And this is the conclusion of the book. Flee, my beloved, brach, run away, flee, and liken yourself to a gazelle or to a fawn of the hinds on the Spice Mountains. Strange verse. He's saying run away. Okay, you would expect the book to end with closeness, with intimacy. Maybe it does. You'll see the commentaries say that it does. But at the first glance, it sounds like he's saying, we're sitting in the garden, you're sitting in the garden, everybody wants to hear you, I also want to hear you. She responds, you want to hear me? Run away. She doesn't say you want to hear me, she says, barach dodi, flee, run away. What is she saying? So the conventional interpretation would be that what she is saying is she doesn't like verse 13. Verse 13 is the man comes and he's saying, we're in the garden, everyone's in the garden, start talking, start singing, we all want to hear you. She says, you want to hear me, you have to meet me alone. So I'll meet you not in the gardens where there are friends listening to your voice, but I will meet you on the mountains of spice. Now, Kabbalistically, this is a very important verse because we discussed it earlier, because in verse number 2, in chapter number 2, she says, there's a very similar verse where she says, I'm not ready for you, come back later, run away. And she says almost the exact verse, liken yourself to a gazelle, to a fawn on the hinds, on the mountains of separation, al harei batar. And here is the same verse with the mountains of spice. So we'll get to that. But in any case, that's the conclusion. The conclusion is, we assume, it's not spelled out, but we assume that there will be a reunification, but it's not going to be the way it is in verse 13. It's going to be the way it is in verse 14. In other words, not the way the man says, oh, everybody's here. We have a party with all my friends. All the guys are here. Why don't you speak to us? Or maybe sing to us. It doesn't say speak or sing, but it says we want to listen to your voice. Everyone's listening to your voice. I also want to hear your voice. And what a wonderful relationship. We can all be here together. And she says, no, I don't want to be here together. If you want to meet, let's meet alone. And that's flee. What is flee? Not run away from me, but you'll see that Rashi says, flee with me and run away from the garden with everybody else. So that's the conventional interpretation. Now we're going to open up the Rashis and read a little bit of the Medrash. But it's interesting that we in the beginning, when we discussed this, we discussed that there are many ways of reading it, and one of the many ways of reading even a simple story. And one of the things we pointed out, that there's a tension here, that the king, if the beloved is the king, if the man is the king, then the king cannot be alone with a person, with a woman, with anybody, because the king is in the palace, and the king is surrounded with people and servants and guards and many other women and concubines, as we mentioned earlier. And in that sense, God is like the king, in the sense that God is the king of everybody, of all of humanity. And for God, he has a relationship with everybody. The woman consistently is saying, I want to be alone, I want intimacy. And in that sense, it's the Jewish people saying we want a unique relationship, not to negate the fact that God is the God of the entire world, but we're saying we want a unique relationship. If that was the case in the beginning of the book, chapter 2 and chapter 1 and chapter 2, and also 4 by the wedding, also chapter 4, here you see it seems like it's repeating itself. In other words, you see the same tension coming to the fore. The man is very comfortable to have a relationship and to spend time with his beloved with all the friends listening. And she says, no, it has to be unique. There has to be a unique relationship. So that's the conclusion of the simple story. Now we're going to open up Rashi, like we said. We're going to go a little bit to the Midrashic interpretation, historic interpretation, and then we're going to go to hopefully the Kabbalistic. If we don't finish the Kabbalistic today, we'll finish it. We'll go do tomorrow. We'll do next week, and but the journey begins. Okay. So who are the brothers, and who are the brothers who are wondering whether their sister is mature? So let's open up the Rashis. In just a minute, I'm just going to. Okay, here we go. So it's a simple story. We have the brothers talking about the woman. I'm saying about the girl. We have a young girl where she's young. She doesn't have, she's not mature. She doesn't have breasts. What are we going to do when it's spoken of her? When people are going to inquire about marriage, we're not sure if she's ready for marriage. That is a simple interpretation. The historic interpretation says Rashi. This is sort of God, the people in heaven, God and his court, God and the angels talking about their sister. Who's their sister? Their sister is the Jewish people below. Why sister? As we mentioned earlier in the book, Bati Lagani, come to my garden, my sister, my bride, are different forms of relationship, of love, and sister is one of them. And here Rashi says that the etymology of the word ach, and therefore achot, sister, comes from the word connection. So let's read Rashi. We have a sister. Achot lanu, we have a sister in the lower realms. So this is God and the angels speaking in the higher realms in heaven and saying we have a sister. Who's the sister? The Jewish people. Why is she called the sister? Who is united and attaches herself to us. You don't see it in the English, but in the Hebrew, united, umita'acha, mit'acha, united is the same word as achot, same root. Mit'acha, la'achot is to unite. Right? You don't see the Rashis in Hebrew, but I'm just saying the Hebrew, this is a translation. The word who is united is a Hebrew translation. I don't understand why, but here we don't have the English, we don't have the Hebrew Rashi. But if there was a Hebrew Rashi here, it would have said, mit'acha u'mit'achedet. I'm sorry, mit'acha u'mitchaberet. United becomes one and is attached. So the word mit'acha, united, is the same root as ach or achot, brother or sister. That's what the etymology means, connection. In other words, so there's the people in heaven, God and the angels are saying, we have a sister down here. Why is she a sister? She's united to us and is desirous to be with us. She is small and humbles herself more than any other nations, as it is stated in Deuteronomy, not because you are more numerous, for they consider themselves insignificant. In other words, Rashi is quoting the verse in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says, not because of you were more numerous, etc., but that is that God chose you, but the opposite, God chose you because you're the smallest of all nations. Now we're a small nation, but are we really the smallest of all nations? So the commentaries explain that the smallest doesn't mean in numbers. Smallest means we're the most humble. The Jewish people keep themselves humble. They're humble people. Now go back to the verse. So the verse says we have a sister, achot lanu ketana. We have a young sister, a small sister, meaning we have a humble sister. And here is the word that I'm talking about, the Rashi that says the word achot. What's the etymology? Hebrew achot, an expression of joining, ichui, moed katan, These are the tears that may not be attached. Mit achi. Here it's a very interesting place where Rashi finds this. That the tractate of Moed Katan is a tractate that tells you the laws of mourning. Begins with the intermediate days of the holiday, but it gets into mourning, and it talks about when your person would tear the garment for kriya, for in the sign of mourning. Are you allowed to resew it? And so for a parent, you may not. For somebody else, you could do it, but not. You can resew it, but not sew it permanently. You have many laws over there. But the term for resewing is ichui, joining. So the word ach means connection. So the bottom line is we have a young sister. What does it mean we have a young sister? We have somebody connecting to us. That's the Jewish people in this earth are connected to God in heaven. And we're young in the sense that we're small. Small means we're humble. Okay, let's continue, make some progress. Who has no breasts? What does that mean? As it is stated concerning the exile of Egypt, breasts fashioned in Ezekiel, when the time of the redemption arrives. But this one has yet no breasts. Her time has not yet reached the time of love. In other words, in Ezekiel, when it describes the exodus of Egypt, we actually say it by the Seder, Shaddai Nechon, we actually say this verse by the Seder, and the Passover Seder. So here we're saying Egypt, when you want to say the time of the redemption, the time of love has arrived, that's the metaphor, that the woman now is mature. But now we're still in exile. So in heaven, they're saying, well, we have we have a sister, we have a Jewish people who's connecting to us, but she's not yet, the time of redemption has not yet come. What shall we do for our sister on the day she is spoken for? When the heathens whisper about her to destroy her, as it is stated, come, let us destroy them from being a nation. In other words, here, not as the verse simply says, what should we do for our sister on the day she is spoken for? Simple interpretation means when somebody wants to marry her. According to the Medrash, it's the opposite. It's when somebody wants to destroy her. And so what's the response? So they continue. So this is still the angels and God discussing. So what are we going to do for her? So it depends. It depends if she's deserving of divine protection. If she is a wall, if she is strong in her faith and in her fear of God, to be against them like a copper wall, that they should not enter her midst, meaning that she will not intermarry with them, and they will not come into her, and she will not be seduced by them. We will build upon her a silver turret. We will be to her as a fortified city, and for a crown and for beauty. And we will build for her the holy city and the chosen temple. And if she is a door which turns on its hinges, and when one knocks on it, it opens, she too, if she opens for them, so that they enter her and she enters them, we will enclose her with cedar boards. We will put into her door wooden boards which rot and which the worms gnaws and eats. Thereupon the congregation of Israel will say, okay, in other words, so the God is saying, so what should we do? The people want to harm her. So the answer is she as mighty as a wall? Is she closed? In other words, does she preserve her identity as a people? Or is she open up? Is she open to assimilation? So what do the Jewish people respond? The Jewish people respond like in a simple story where the brothers were not sure what the status of the girl is. And the girl says, no, you say I have no breasts, but the answer is I do. And I am like a choma, I am a wall. I am protected. So what does Rashi say? I am a wall, a strong wall in the love of my beloved. So with the love of God, we're strong in the love of God. My breasts are like towers. These are the synagogues and study halls which nurture Israel with words of Torah. So we did have spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity, we're studying Torah, we're giving nutrition, and which is the study of the walls of Torah, of the study of Torah. Then, when I said this, I was in his eyes as one who finds peace, like a bride who is found perfect and finds peace in her husband's house. In other words, we're saying we're ready. Now we deal with verse 11 and 12, which is the vineyard. I don't want to go off topic, but that's how the nations of the world who oppress the Jews are going to have to pay us back and make us and make it up to us. But that's another story. Let's get to the end. 13. You who sit in the garden. So again, what was the simple interpretation? The simple interpretation is that the man is sitting with his friends in the garden, and he tells her, you're sitting in the garden, let me hear your voice. Everybody, all my friends are listening to voice. I also want to hear your voice. So what does it mean? If the brothers are the angels, the people sitting in the garden are also angels. Because now what is the garden? So let's see the garden. The Holy One, blessed be he, says to the congregation of Israel, you are scattered in exile, grazing in the gardens of strangers, and sitting in synagogues and study halls. The friends hearken to your voice. The ministering angels, your friends, children of God like you, hearken and come to listen to your voice in the synagogues. So here Rashi says the Ganim, the gardens are, I'm not sure what Rashi is saying even. It could be in exile in many gardens. We're not in our natural habitat. We're not in the temple. We're not in Israel. We're scattered throughout the exile. But in the exile, we're in gardens. What are the gardens? We're study halls, synagogues and study halls. And now what happened? What's the greatness of the study of Torah in exile? That even our friends, who are the friends? The friends are the angels. The friends come to the Jewish people to hear how the Jewish people are studying Torah. In other words, the angels, what are they doing in heaven? In heaven, the angels are studying Torah. But they would prefer to come and hear the Torah study from the Jewish people sitting in the study halls and in the synagogues scattered throughout the exiles. And maybe also on the Zoom calls, not just the synagogues, now that we have Zoom. Let me hear it. In other words, God is saying that the Chaverim, your friends, are listening to the voice. I want to hear it, says Rashi. And afterwards, they will declare God's sanctity. As it is said in Job, when the morning stars sing together, these are the Israelites, and afterwards, and all the angels of God will shout. So this is based on the Medrash that explains, the Talmud explains, that the angels cannot sing the praises to God before the Jewish people sing the praises to God. When we say Kadosh, when we say Kedusha, when we sanctify God in the morning in our prayers, that is what allows for the children of God, for the angels to do so. So this is what God is saying. Chaverim, the friends, are coming to hear your prayers, your study. In other words, the angels want to hear the study of the Jewish people, even in exile. And then Hashmi'ini, you could make your voice heard, but Rashi is saying you could make your voice heard means you allow for the angels to sing. Now we get to the final verse, which is flee. Where are we fleeing to? Right? The Jewish people are scattered throughout the exile in the study halls. Now we say, now is our response. Barach Doidi, where now it's in the masculine. In other words, speaking in the masculine. So we're speaking to him, to our beloved. Flee, my beloved. This is the woman, the Jewish people speaking to God. Flee, but flee, again, we talked about the issue of flee means run away. Does it mean run away from us? No, Rashi says it means run away with us. Flee, my beloved, from this exile and redeem us from among them. So this is premised on the concept that when the Jewish people are in exile, God's in exile. So when we say God should leave, means God should flee and take us with him. And liken yourself to a gazelle to hasten the redemption and to cause your Shekhinah to rest. What is a gazelle? We already talked about this in the past, and we talked about this in chapter 2. A gazelle is a symbol of speed, right? So barach, flee from the exile with great speed and take us out of here. Where to? The Spice Mountains. What is the Spice Mountains? This is the Mount Moriah and the temple. May it be built speedily and in our days, amen. And that's Rashi's conclusion to the book Song of Songs. Why is the Temple Mountain called Mountains of Spice? So you could say because simply in the temple, they offered incense to God. But also there's a medrash that says that the reason why the mountain is called Mount Moriah is because that's the place where spices grew. Hashem Hamor Hatov, there's more. More is a more. We had it in English here. We has the name of a spice that appears many times in this book, mirth or myrrh. I forgot already how they pronounce it. And the point is that the spices is a metaphor for the Holy Temple. So the book concludes by the Jewish people saying, God tells the Jewish people, "Oh, it's wonderful. You know, you're great. All the angels are coming to hear your singing, praising God and studying Torah and praying in the synagogues and study halls throughout the exile." But the Jewish people say, we don't want that. We want you to flee, hasten and flee like a gazelle, and we want to meet you at the Harei Bisamim, the Spice Mountains, which is the temple. May it be speedily in our days, and when we're going to live happily ever after. We're not done. We're not there yet, because again, Rashi is reading it the historical perspective, and the historical perspective, we're still in the story. We're still in the garden. We're up to verse 13. We never got to verse 14 yet, right? We're sitting in the garden studying Torah, and the angels come to listen to our Torah study and to our prayer, but we have not yet had the reunification with God on the mountains of spice. So that's the culmination. The culmination is that yearning to reconnect to God in the temple, and we live happily ever after. That's the conclusion from this level, the first two levels, the simple story, and then the story of the pshat, of the historic perspective. And then we have a few minutes left. We'll start with the Kabbalistic. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Good morning, Rabbi, and thank you once again. So my question to you is this a parable, so to speak, that Solomon writes, or is it more autobiographical with the punchline being, these are my justifications for building the temple, and this is what you got to do?
Right, so it all depends. It all depends how you want to hold the book. You can read the book in many different ways. That's what we keep saying. And according to the sages, according to the Medrash, this is a prophecy. In other words, Solomon builds a temple, but Solomon is smart enough to know that just like when you go to the marriage and you go to the wedding, right? So the building of the temple is the wedding. So you go to the wedding, people get married, they fall in love, and love is blinding. So they think they're not going to have any tension. They're not going to have any issues. So could you imagine someone gets up at the wedding and says, let me tell you what's going to happen. There's going to be challenge. There's going to be pain. There's going to be betrayal. But ultimately, you can overcome. And that's really what Solomon is doing, according to the sages. When he builds the temple, he says, let me tell you the real story. Let me tell you the real story of the true love song. The true love song is not what you think it is at your wedding when you're still in bliss, right? The true love song is the love that will come after the pain and after the separation. And Solomon is saying it in the beginning of our history so that when we descend into the exile, we should understand that it's not the end of the story. It's only a chapter in our love. So in that sense, it's prophecy. Now, you could say Solomon is talking about his own life. In his own life, he had these ups and downs within his own love life, which is true. It's probably true, probably both, right? It's true on multiple dimensions. I also want to say one more thing that Bob reminded me of, that according to the simple interpretation, some people say, some scholars believe, I don't know if that they're, some scholars, contemporary scholars, are saying as follows. Why does the song end with flee? You would expect the song to end with, that's really what they're saying. They're saying, she's saying, I want to reunite with you. I want to reunite with you on the mountains of spice. So use a word that connotes closeness. Why does it use a word that connotes distance, flee? So Rashi solves the problem by saying, flee with me. But the verse doesn't say that, I'm sorry, right? So what's the flee? So there's a Kabbalistic interpretation, which we'll get to later. But even on the level of Pshat, on the level of the simple level, some people say, because that's the nature of marriage. The nature of marriage is, of any relationship, is that as close as you become, you never fully understand the other person, because the other person is a soul and the soul is infinite. So there are always layers of the relationship that as close as and intimate as you become, you have to understand that there's still a distance. And the relationship, as it progresses, is all about discovering new dimensions within the other person. But if you think you know the other person, there's no relationship. So what she's saying here, at the moment of intimacy, she's saying barach, flee, which is a word that represents distance. And she understands that as much as she wants unity and she wants intimacy with the person, the other person there's always an element that is distant. And that's why the song does not end with live happily ever after. It ends with flee, even on the simple level. The historic level, we're not there yet. But even on the simple level of the simple song, the word she uses to describe the reunification is brach, is flee, because that's indicating that you never get to a point where the intimacy is complete. I know you, you know me, and that's it. If that were the case, then life is boring. Right? And it's impossible, because you can never know yourself fully, because you have dimensions within yourself that have to be unlocked, and certainly within the other person. So in that sense, barach, run away, flee, it represents the idea that there is a distance, that there will always be more to discover. So I thought that was interesting and worth mentioning.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Did they ever consummate their marriage?
The short answer is, okay, the short answer is that it depends how you want to read it, okay? The short answer is depends how you want to read it. The way we took, the conventional way that we're going to read it is that there was, let me start from the other direction. Let me start from the interpretation. Did the Jewish people and God ever consummate their marriage? So the answer is, in some sense, yes. We had the giving of the Torah, and we had the building of the temple. which according to the interpretation of the song, that's chapter 5. Bati lagani achoti kala. I came to my garden, my sister, my bride. There's a moment of unity. Okay. That is one way to read. However, we have not yet fully consummated the marriage because we're not truly fully united with God. So the real marriage is going to be when Mashiach comes in the future redemption. In the language of the Mishnah says that the giving of the Torah was like the betrothal, and the marriage is the Mishnah says that building of a temple is like the marriage. But historically, the marriage is not yet fully complete. When Mashiach comes, we'll have the complete marriage. In other words, it's not clear. The answer to your question is not clear. It seems like there are stages. Even if they did consummate the marriage has not yet fully been, what's the word I'm looking for? It has not yet been fully established in the proper way. So the answer is there was some sort of consummation. There was a marriage. Whether they had intimacy, I don't know. There's no verse in the verse that implies intimacy. It could be they got to the wedding, and they went to the wedding and they had the after parties and everything was fine. They had the Shabbat brachas, but there was no intimacy. It could be nowhere in the verse does it say intimacy. And then there was separation. They got into a fight and then they separate. And ultimately now is when they're coming together and she's saying, meet me on the Spice Mountains. And there's a beautiful verse. There is a beautiful verse in chapter 7. Let's look at chapter 7 for a moment. Come, my beloved. This is she talking. Let us go out to the field. Let us lodge in the villages. This is right before chapter 8. So this is sort of when she wants to consummate the marriage. Let us arise early in the vineyards. Let us see whether the vine has blossomed. The tiny grapes have developed. The pomegranates have lost their flowers. In other words, let's see if nature is blossoming. In other words, which is a metaphor for let's see if I didn't share the screen. I apologize. Right? So this is chapter 7. I'll read it again. The Chadadi, she is saying, come, my beloved, let us go out to the field. Let us lodge in the villages. Let us arise early to the vineyards. Let us see whether the vine has blossomed. The tiny grapes have developed. The pomegranates have lost their flowers. In other words, let's see if nature is flourishing. But really what she's saying is it's a metaphor. Let's see if our love is ripe. There I will give you my love. Sham etein edodi lach. There I will give you my love. This is probably the most closest metaphor for intimacy. In other words, she did not give him the love yet. And then she says, or the narrator says, the pots of figs have given forth their fragrance, and on our doorways are all manners of sweet fruits, both new and old, which I have hidden away for you, my beloved. In other words, we both have fruit to give to each other, which is a metaphor for intimacy. And here it seems like we're the closest to get there. And that's what chapter 8, she says, if we're ready, then I want it to be out in the open. I don't want it to be concealed. So the short answer is that probably in the ancient world, there were more stages of connection of marriage that we have today. We mentioned that before, that like in our chuppah, we have kiddushin and nisuyin, betrothal and marriage, and we do it together. We just have a little break, we read the ketubah in between. But in the ancient world, there could be up to a year between the two. It's not 100% clear if they consummated their marriage back in chapter 4 and 5. They certainly had a wedding. That's probably clear. So there's some stage of unity. Was it the full unity? I don't know. Ultimately, certainly not the full unity the way it's going to be at the end of chapter 8. And historically, that's what happened. We had a relationship with God. Sinai was the betrothal. We built a temple. We tried to build a marriage. It was incomplete. It wasn't properly done. It was premature. And therefore, we have the exile. And now we matured, and now we're ready for the ultimate marriage. So the short answer to your question is, I don't know. In other words, the short answer to the question is, even if there was some level of intimacy, it's not the full extent. What exactly does that mean in the simple sense? Did they have physical intimacy? I don't know. The story doesn't tell me. But it knows there was certainly some place, there was certainly a marriage ceremony and a celebration that followed, which quickly turned into separation. As we read in the beginning of chapter 5, he's knocking on the door, she's not opening, etc. So I don't know if I answered your question. I'm not sure.
You did. Thank you very much.
Good. Okay, now we have to open the Kabbalah. The question is how Problem is that Rabbi Shneir Zalman didn't write about this verse. I'm reading from his grandson, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rabbi Tzemach Tzedek, Menachem Mendel of Schneerson, the third Chabad Rebbe. The problem is that he writes at great length. He writes pages and pages and pages. So I'm going to give you the gist of the idea, and then we'll decide maybe next week if you want to read it inside more carefully. But I'll give you the big idea. There's a few big ideas. One of them we mentioned earlier in chapter 2, but there's a few big ideas. In short, what we're going to say is as follows. There is two ways where we relate to God. There's two ways the way God relates to us, the way we relate to God. And let's start from the beginning. The beginning is God is infinite. And infinity is amazing. The problem is we cannot relate to infinity. And therefore, for God to create the world, the Kabbalah will tell you there has to be a tzimtzum, contraction. He has to conceal his infinite light. And he has to create a little ray of light that will come into this world to create. That's called the light hamimale, the light that fills up. In other words, the light that is invested within creation. And then the infinite light is what they call, as we mentioned many times here, or hasovev, the encompassing light, the light that surrounds the creation. When you say it surrounds, it means it's too powerful to be expressed within the consciousness of creation because it's infinity. And a finite being cannot understand and cannot accept infinity. And that is the two general ways, the way God expresses himself, the light that it surrounds, the infinite light, and then the finite light. Okay. Now, let's think about just for example, the study of Torah. Study of Torah has to be internalized. Study of Torah means you have to understand what the Torah is saying. If you understand it, you grasped it. If you grasped it, then then you're not grasping infinity. You cannot grasp infinity because you have to really understand it. And to understand it, it has to be a finite idea. You cannot understand infinity. So when we study Torah, what are we internalizing? We're internalizing the limited light of God, the finite light of God, the ray of God. Not only when we study Torah, but also what is the reward for all the Torah and the mitzvah that we do in this world? So the award, there's two levels of the award. That's the chapter, verse 13 and 14. That's where we're headed. But the award would be paradise, Gan Eden, the world to come. The world to come, what do we do in the world to come? The world to come, after the soul departs from the body, what is this? What happens to the soul? So the soul goes to heaven, and there it gets great pleasure. What's the pleasure that the soul gets? So, if you're other religions, they have other descriptions. You can get 70 virgins. What is our description of heaven? So our description is that the sages sit and they derive benefit from the ray of the Shekhinah. Nehenin miziv hashchina. Every word here is precise. They derive benefit from the ray of the Shekhinah, a ray. So what they're doing is they're studying Torah. And studying Torah, wisdom is the tremendous form of pleasure. The greatest form of pleasure is wisdom. We could talk about that it's something physical, the more you have, the less you want it. Wisdom and understanding, the more you have, the more it increases your appetite. So that's why the pleasure is a true pleasure. But in any case, what are we doing in heaven? What does the soul do in heaven after it departs from the body? It sits in heaven and it studies Torah. Now, it doesn't study the Torah the way we have it, which is, what happens if my ox goes your ox? That's sort of the outer layers. But it goes to the core and understands the divine wisdom invested within the Torah. And that's a great pleasure. Okay, it's wonderful. So it's wonderful. But it is the memale, it's the ray of God. It's not the essence of God. Where do you get the essence of God? So, according to the Kabbalistic interpretation, the essence of God you get at the resurrection. There happens to be a big debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides about what is the ultimate reward for the person. They both agree that the soul goes to heaven after it passes, and that there is a resurrection. How exactly is details? What exactly is the definition? The details of the resurrection is a different discussion. But they both agree. Maimonides says one of the 13 principles is to believe that there will be a resurrection. But Maimonides believes that the resurrection is not the final redemption, because resurrection is the body is resurrected. Now the body will live again. right? Let's say the body suffered in its lifetime. So there'll be a resurrection, and the body will be rewarded. So Maimonides says that cannot be the full reward, the ultimate reward for the soul, because when the body is invested in the soul, when the soul is invested in the body, that's a distraction from holiness, a distraction from spirituality. So it could never understand God as much while it's invested in the body, as much as it will understand God when it's divested from the body in heaven. So the way Maimonides puts it, even if there's a resurrection, the soul comes back into the body, then it will die, and then the soul goes back to reunite with God, and that's the ultimate redemption. In other words, there is resurrection on this earth, and there's paradise in the next world. And the ultimate redemption is paradise in the next world. That's Maimonides. Nachmanides disagrees, and the Kabbalah takes the position of Nachmanides, or really Nachmanides takes the position of the Kabbalists. But the Hasidic movement also accepts the opinion of Nachmanides. Nachmanides says the ultimate reward for the soul is in this world. How could that be? Doesn't Maimonides put forth a good argument that when the soul is in this world, can never sense spirituality as it would when the soul is in heaven? So what's the Kabbalah's answer? Kabbalah's answer is the ultimate reward is not about wisdom. Because wisdom, by definition, is the ray. If you're going to understand it, it's only the ray of God. And that's not the ultimate reward. Ultimately, the connection to God, if you want to connect to God's essence, then you want to connect to the infinity of God. And the infinity of God cannot be understood with wisdom. It could be sensed, but it cannot be understood. And it could be sensed equally in the next world and this world, probably in this world more. There's no wisdom. So that's another discussion, why more in this world. But certainly it could be sensed in this world. And that is the final two words of the book, according to the Hasidic interpretation. She says, let's go, flee. And what does he say? Where are we fleeing to? The mountains of spice. Al Hare Bisamim. What is spice? Right? Wrong chapter. It's chapter 7. Let's go to chapter 8. Chapter 8. Flee, my beloved, and liken yourself to a gazelle, to a fawn on the hinds of the spice mountains. What is spice mountains? So spice is very interesting. Spice represents smell. And smell, according to the Kabbalists, is a metaphor for the surrounding light of God. Why? Because smell affects you, and it affects you very deeply. However, it's not internalized the way food is. So in other words, you're not consuming it the way you would consume food. So in other words, it's not a light, it's not the limited light that you could understand. It's the surrounding light, it's the infinite light of God that gives you pleasure without you having to consume it. And that is, according to the Kabbalah, that's verse 14. So let's go back, 13. You who sit in the gardens. What is the gardens? So we know that paradise, Gan Eden, is called garden, the Garden of Eden. That's where the soul goes after it passes on. But it says it plural, because according to the Kabbalah, there are two levels of Gan Eden. There's the lower Gan Eden and there's the higher Gan Eden. If you need the Kabbalistic words, this world is the world of Asiyah, of action. The world of formation, the world of Yetzirah, is called Gan Eden Hatachta, in the lower Gan Eden. The world of Bria, the world of creation, is called the higher Gan Eden. So there's generally two categories of Gan Eden. Why do you need two categories? One is more emotional, one's more intellectual. Without getting into that right now. The bottom line is that verse 13 is the souls in the Garden of Eden is a description of the angels coming to hear the Torah being studied with the souls in the Garden of Eden. And that seems to be like the unity with God, the ultimate unity of God. And God is saying, look, when your souls are in heaven, everybody's here, everybody's happy, even the angels are happy. What do the Jewish people respond? We say it's wonderful to be in the Garden of Eden, but we don't want to be in the Garden of Eden. What we want to be in the space of the essence of God. And therefore, we have to flee. We'll talk about the flee in a minute. And we have to go to the spice mountains. Spice mountains, Bahare Besamim, is a spice. The spice is not internalized like wisdom. It surrounds you. It creates an atmosphere. And that is the concept of the Or HaSovev, the encompassing light, that you can only achieve in the physical world, because the physical world is where God's essence is invested. Why that is another discussion. We'll get to that in a second. So that is the big idea. 13 and 14 is 13 represents the soul's ultimate connection to God. It's not ultimate, but the soul's connection to God after it passes when it's in the Garden of Eden. And 14 represents connection to God in this world the resurrection, where you can have the essence of God, and that's where we live happily ever after. But to do this properly, we want to look at the other verse. Oh, so what's barach? What's flee? So we already discussed this verse. We already discussed this, really. The truth is we already discussed this. So I'm going to, because we discussed it when we did chapter 2. So what I want to do is I want to show you both verses side by side, hopefully if we can do that. And then we'll see how this verse is really having a conversation. Chapter 8 is really a continuation of chapter 2. In other words, it's responding to that. So what was chapter 2? Until the sun spreads, we had this whole conversation in chapter 2 where he wasn't available for her, and he didn't tell her where she was. And then finally, he asks her, "Where are you?" She doesn't respond, right? My dove, she's talking to him. My dove is in the clefts of the rock, in the curvature of the steps. Show me your appearance. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is pleasant and your appearance is comely. He's asking, show me your appearance, means she's hiding. And she says, I can't do it. I'm busy. Seize for us the foxes, the little foxes who destroy the vineyards, for the vineyards are with tiny grapes. Basically, she's saying, I can't come with you now. I'm busy guarding my vineyards. And basically, she says, have a nice afternoon. Verse 17, until the sun spreads and the shadows flee, go around liking yourself, my beloved, to a gazelle or to a fawn of the hinds on distant mountains. Really, we said, Hare Batar, distant mountains. Batar literally means separated mountains. And it's a very similar verse. Verse 17 of this verse, go around, liken yourself, my beloved, to a gazelle or to a fawn of the hinds, of the hinds on distant mountains, is very similar to the final verse, which is, flee, my beloved, and liken yourself to a gazelle, to a fawn of the hinds on the spice mountains. It's too hard to ignore. The similarity is so powerful. So what did we explain over there? We explained over there is that verse 2 is God expressing himself in the physical world. We said mountains of separation, distant mountains are really mountains of separation. That represents the physical world, because the physical world is the world in which we feel separated from God. Nevertheless, we said that in the physical world, God is present. He's running and he's like a gazelle. He's present on a distant mountain. And we said, what's the gazelle? What's the speed? Gazelle represents the leap, and the leap to get from the infinity of God to the physical world, that's the leap. And God is present in the physical world, the world of distance. When Mashiach comes, then we realize that what we thought were mountains of distance are really mountains of spice. In other words, in the physical world where divine light, the ray is not present, but the essence is present. The light is not there, the food is not there, but the spices are there. And this leads to a very deep Kabbalistic concept, which Rabbi Shneur Zalman wrote in his book of Tanya. But he wrote it, it's part of a letter that he wrote a few days before he passed away. And that's the paradox, that in some sense, specifically it's the physical world that's connected to the essence of God. Why is that? Because in the spiritual realm, every level feels its spiritual source. That's really one definition of spirituality. Spirituality means if a spiritual being understands its source, feels the divine presence which creates it, the divine light that creates it. So in other words, spirituality will always feel its source. What's the definition of the physical world? The physical world does not feel like it has a source. The creation, the psyche of creation is, I was always here. It's not true, I wasn't always here. But I feel like I was always here. In my psyche, I don't need anything. I don't need God. In my psyche, the physical existence is independent, doesn't have a source. Says the Kabbalah, says Rabbi Shneur Zalman, he says it beautifully. He says, only God, only the essence of God, which does not have a source, could create a creation in whose psyche feels that he has no source. In other words, where do you get this concept that something cannot feel its source? That does not exist in the spiritual realms, because the spiritual realm always feels its source. No matter what level you are in the evolution of the worlds, of the spiritual worlds, every level will always feel its source. Everything in this physical world has to have a spiritual source. So where does this concept come from that there can be a creation that doesn't feel its source? Where does that come from? It doesn't come from spirituality. It doesn't come from the ray of God, because the ray of God has a source. What's the source of the ray of God? The essence of God. right? What's the source of the ray? The light that gives the ray. So where is there a phenomenon in all of this entire spiritual realms that there could be something that has no source or feels like it has no source? Answer is only the essence of God has no source. So again, the words of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, only a creation. I have to show it to you. It's too beautiful. Give me just a second. Yes, HaKodesh. Okay, now we have to find it. I love this. Okay, it's beautiful. Here we go. Also, remember, Rabbi Shneur Zalman wrote this a few days before he passed away, and he was feeling the power. You think before a person passes away, they're already thinking about the next world, thinking about the light of Gan Eden. Rabbi Shneur Zalman is thinking about the awesome power of life on this earth. So here we go. Says Rabbi Shneur Zalman as follows. He goes into this whole thing of the creation. Okay, so here we go. I'll start from here. I'm starting in the middle. For the light is like its source, the luminary, i.e. the very core and essence of the blessed emanator. Okay. We're talking about the essence of God, whose being is of his essence. His is an essential form of being. He is not, heaven forfend, brought into being by some other ilah preceding himself. In other words, everything in this universe, not just the physical universe, but also in the spiritual worlds, everything is brought into being by a source. Everything has a cause. What does not have a cause? Only the essence of God has no cause. When we say it has no cause, we could say mitziuto me'atzmuto. His existence is from himself. Everything else, his existence is from its source. The essence of God, his existence is from itself. So he says, whose being is of his essence. Okay. So only God, who exists by himself, it is therefore in his power and ability alone. In other words, nothing else can do this, to create something, a yesh, out of absolute naught, ayin, and nothingness, without this yesh having any other cause and reason preceding it. Okay, so what's happening here is the physical world is creation ex nihilo, something from nothing. In some sense, the physical world doesn't have a source, doesn't feel it's a source. What Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying here is, if you go and you talk about the spiritual evolution of the world, you start with spirituality and the way you create spiritual worlds is you always minimize the light. And every time you minimize the light, you get another world. But still there's going to be a gap, because if you minimize as much light as you want, you're not going to have a physical existence. Physical existence is completely new. Nachmanides calls it yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. Where does it come? It comes from nothing. Where does it come from? It comes from the essence of God. So only the essence of God, which has no source, can create something from nothing, something that has no source. So what are we saying here? We're saying, ironically, when you're in heaven and you're in Gan Eden and you're in the Garden of Eden, in the lower level, the higher level, doesn't really matter. And all the angels are coming to hear your study of Torah in Gan Eden. That's wonderful. But over there, all you have is Mamale, all you have is the infinite light, the light of Hashem that fills the world, the limited ray of godliness, which you could understand and assimilate. In this world, which appears in chapter 2, same verse, chapter 2, we said we classified the world as mountains of separation because we feel separate from God. But we say God flees to this world. Flee would mean, and we say gazelle, which means there's a leap. There's because there's a tremendous gap between God and this physical world. Nevertheless, God is here. God leaps over the gap and is present in this world. So throughout the exile, it appears that this world is a world of separation. After we go to Gan Eden, after we internalize the limited light of Hashem, then we get to the deeper recognition. Then we're able to smell, not internalize, but smell and appreciate the fragrance of the essence of the light. And therefore, Gan Eden is a very important step. You have to go to Gan Eden. You have to be able to understand as much of the limited light as possible. And that's what you do in verse 13 of chapter 8. We're sitting in the Garden of Eden. But after you get to that level, then you come back into this physical world, because this physical world is ultimately where the unity with the essence of God can happen. And that's what happens when Mashiach comes, after we internalized, all sat in the gardens. Rashi says the gardens are study of Torah. The Medrash says the gardens could be, in the Kabbalistic interpretation, is the gardens is studying Torah, not in this world, but studying Torah in the Garden of Eden. In other words, after the soul passes. But whatever it is, it's study of Torah. It's internalizing the limited light of Hashem. And that's verse 13. That's a wonderful verse. But after you get to verse 13, you can get to verse 14. And verse 14 is, no, we understand that specifically in the physical world is where you can get the essence of God. And that's the level of the mountains of spice. Because spice is something that creates an aroma, it creates an atmosphere, it affects you, but you don't internalize. And that's the unity with the essence of God. A lot more to say about this. The Tzemach Tzedek has 30 pages on what I just told you. Maybe we should read it. Maybe we'll read it next week. We'll see. But the bottom line is, at least for the first round of delving into the Hasidic teachings of Song of Songs, I think we have concluded the first round. So Mazel Tov. We should really pull out a cake and l'chaim and say Mazel Tov. And the point here is that the song is ongoing and the love song continues. And we should get to the mountains of spice speedily in our days. So that's the we have to see what we'll do next week. Maybe we'll read this discourse inside. Maybe we'll start something else. But in any case, this is the story. I hope to one day, maybe within the next few months, put out essays, one per each of the verses we discussed. So in other words, I have most of them. Every class is an essay where you would have the simple meaning, the pshat, then the historical meaning from the sages, and then the Kabbalistic meaning. And I guess that gets us to about 25 or 27 or 28. And then we could have it for reference and publish it. So that's the short term. That's the plan for the not too distant future, God willing, and good health.
Hey, that would be wonderful.
Chazaku Baruch, wonderful Shabbos. And that's really what's happening on Friday. People say Shir HaShirim every Friday afternoon. And what's happening? It's the love song, it's the unity. Coming back with God on the mountains of spice is what happens every Shabbat, in some sense. And eventually will happen fully when Mashiach comes, which the sages say, what's Mashiach? Yom Shekolo Shabbat. It's a day that all week is Shabbat. The entirety of that period is Shabbat. So now we have a taste of that every seventh day of the week, every Shabbat. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and see each other.